Good evening. I want to welcome everyone to this evening's program, a Goldman Forum on Press and Foreign Affairs, with the editor of the British paper The Guardian, Alan Rusbridger, and welcome all of the World Affairs Council audience on radio. I'm particularly pleased to have Alan Rusbridger here. I think all too often we fail to be aware of the ways in which people in other countries hold their media, run their media, and what the differences are. And I think in The Guardian's case, as I think you'll see during the conversation, there's a particularly interesting countermodel of a newspaper. And we want to talk a little bit about that and how the whole world of journalism looks to Alan in Britain and what he sees here in America. Alan was got his education at Magdalen College at Cambridge. He is also, interestingly enough, a classical pianist. I had the pleasure the other night, Alan, of pulling up your Granta article on that Beethoven sonata, and I assume that was you playing those few little bars of the fugue. He's worked for The Observer, the London Daily News, and since 1995 has been editor at The Guardian. Now, what makes The Guardian so interesting is that it's also hooked up to something called the Scots Trust Foundation, which means that it is a curious hybrid between market-driven commercial media outlet and something that is more of a public interest, almost NGO-like foundation, and we'll talk a bit about that. The Guardian's website, interestingly enough, has 11 million people visiting it every month. The paper itself has a circulation that's just under 400,000. That's an interesting fact, and it's no accident that he's here in California to talk to people on the sort of electronic media side in Silicon Valley. Clearly the wind is blowing in a discernible direction. The Guardian has won the British Newspaper Awards for the best newspaper online for I forget how many years, and I urge you all to look at the Guardian's website. It's a very good one, a very well-trafficked one, and I think probably of all the major newspapers of the world is one of the most successful and used. So, Alan, why don't you come up and we will begin our conversation. Let's start by me asking you, what do you perceive, what is the role of a newspaper in our society today? What are the ingredients that, in your view, comprise the full menu of duties?
Well, I think it's what it's always been. I mean, that there is a core function that we should never lose sight of, which is and it's difficult to talk about this without sounding pompous and high-blown, but it is about, giving the citizens the tools to be informed so that they can make choices about government and about their own lives. And I think that's always been the function of a newspaper. And I think probably as the winds of crisis swirl around newspapers, it'll be important that we get back to that. Now,
do you think we've strayed?
Well, I think in the kind of market conditions which have become more and more hostile, some elements of the media have retreated from that. So you've seen a retreat into, certainly in Britain, into large areas of entertainment journalism, which have very little to do with what I've just described. And that has brought short-term circulation gains, but changes, I think, the feeling of what a newspaper is. And I think at that point you get a fracture between this connection of the kind of almost duty of a newspaper to inform and actually how people perceive newspapers. And that's a very dangerous fracture in my view, because it then makes it difficult to argue for the kind of core purpose and the kind of privileges that go with being the mediator of information.
I mean, it is interesting that you feel almost a little sensitive about speaking of duty, as if somehow in the world in which we find ourselves, it's somehow I mean, I know you believe in it, and yet I think I too avoid using such expressions as if it was something a man of the cloth might say, rather than an ink-stained wretch. But describe the duty as you perceive it. After all, you're living that duty, aren't you?
Well, I think it is something that journalists are easily embarrassed talking about. And certainly in Britain, where the kind of institution that we're talking in tonight is fairly scarce, i.e. someone which looks at journalism and holds it up to the light and examines how it is done and how it should be done. There's not much of that goes on in Britain, and there's a feeling that journalism is a sort of grubby old trade, which in some senses it is, and you shouldn't sort of get terribly high-blown and erudite in trying to analyze it. You just do it. And so I think that's why people are embarrassed, and these sort of high-flown phrases about the connection between what we do and one's role as a citizen, they come awkwardly from the lips of a journalist, but I believe it.
And do you think that America has done any better or has a different situation in terms of its discussion on this topic? In other words, the non-commercial side of what it is that journalists and editors do.
Well, I think American journalists, from my experience, and I don't want to overstate my experience of American journalists, but I think there's a better conversation here. I think there's a higher awareness of what journalism can do and should do, and I think American journalists talk about that more and are just more serious about it. And I think, I don't know why that is, but it's just, I think it's a higher level of discussion. Now, whether that's filtered through into the papers and is always reflected in the execution, I don't know, but I think the level of discussion is higher.
Well, we may be good in theory and less estimable in practice.
It's always possible.
I mean, it's interesting because I think Americans very often, forgetting the tabloid tradition of journalism in Britain, look at The Guardian, look at the Channel 4, look at the BBC and think, well, that's quality. Well,
some of it is. I mean, I should preface all I say tonight about British journalism by saying what is obvious, that some of it is terrible. Some of it is brutal and untrue and intrusive and vulgar and all that. And so I don't come here as a great ambassador for the British journalistic tradition. But I think during the conversation, I hope there are merits to what British journalism does for all its roughness, which can be contrasted with what American journalism does for all its ambition and politeness. And probably the other thing you have to say in sketching out these two different traditions is that in Britain, you can't talk about the tabloids without talking about the BBC and vice versa. So you have this strange mixed economy of information in which you've got the BBC, which is publicly funded, highly regulated, so that it has great obligations of impartiality and fairness and balance. And you've got that at one level. And at the other end, you've got this kind of Wild West in the tabloids who have no rules and no obligations to bias or impartiality or anything, and a lot of stuff in between. And so there's something in a way that's quite healthy about that tension, but you have to see the whole picture before you can really describe individual parts of it.
I mean, it is the sacred and the profane, isn't it, in a kind of a spectrum of, do you think that the profane end of British journalism is more profane than the American end?
It's appalling. I mean, I think those of you who haven't lived there or passed through Britain have no concept. In the mid-1980s, I worked in an American newspaper office. I just had a desk there when I was working for that old scoundrel Robert Maxwell. He'd started a London evening paper, and I was its American correspondent. And I went down each day to buy the New York Post and the New York Daily News, because I sort of because I do actually quite like reading tabloid papers. And these American journalists were horrified to see, they wouldn't have these papers in their office, and they would come and sort of steal mine, but they wouldn't consider buying one. But these were, the New York Post has art critics and books pages, and is quite a serious paper compared with the red tops in Britain, which wouldn't know a book page if they saw one, and are basically devoted to turning over people in public life, especially their sex lives, if that's what they. It's more like these supermarket tabloids here, but except these are mainstream papers that are sold as organs of news. So it's quite a difficult thing to describe to people who don't know them.
You all operate under a rather quaint set of principles that were, as I understand it, laid down by the founder, C.P. Scott, or maybe he wasn't the founder, but back in the 30s, and they are honesty, cleanness, which is integrity, courage, fairness, and a sense of duty to the reader and community. That's very high-minded. How did this rather high-minded set of principles arrive out of the situation you've just described?
Well, it's worth sketching a bit of the history of the paper. The Guardian was founded in 1821 in response to the Peterloo massacre, because there was no organ in which the founder could describe the events of that day. And that was the impetus to found it. And this great editor, C.P. Scott, it's basically been in one family since 1821, C.P. Scott edited the paper for 57 years, which is a record that I don't think is going to be, I'm certainly not going to break it. And he died in 1932, and he was everything you've described. He was a great man, very high-minded, principled, serious. And he died, and his son took over as editor, and his son was killed in a boating accident the following year. And it was the double set of death duties that would have crippled the paper that led the family to basically give away their interest in the paper and put it into a trust. And the trust was there and still exists, and its only purpose is to ensure the existence of the Guardian in perpetuity. And when each editor of the Guardian is appointed, and there haven't been many, they are simply told to go on editing the paper as heretofore. And it's basically on principles of the sort that you've described. And I guess your next question is how you do that in a kind of market economy and the most competitive newspaper market in the world.
Well, let me just change the question a bit. You have this cookie jar, if you will, off on the side. You do sell advertisements. You do want to make money. You do want to at least break even. But what is your relationship as an editor to this trust? Can you just sort of reach over in a bad day and pull some resources your way?
Well, the trust commands me to be profit-seeking, which is a nice thing that we would, I think many of my colleagues would envy me that. But in the front row, the chief executive of The Guardian is sitting, and she's a pretty stern taskmaster, or taskmistress, or whatever.
Would you like to stand and take a bow?
So we sit on the board, and we seriously aim to make money. And in many years we succeed, and in some years we don't. This is a year where we've just bought new printing presses, and we're spectacularly not making money.
What did they cost?
They cost £80 million, which is about, whatever that is, $140 million.
Would I be safe in assuming that the Scott Trust paid for them?
Well, the Scott Trust, I think the cleverness of the Scott Trust is that over the years it's built up a very profitable company that is run on separate lines from The Guardian. So there is, for instance, a wonderful magazine which I urge you to buy if you're ever in England, called Auto Trader, which just sells second-hand cars. And it's a wonderful way if you're ever looking for a second-hand car. And this is, seriously, this is a wonderful business that makes about £100 million clear profit every year. And that sits in a business, but they don't give it to me or Carolyn. We have to run the Guardian on profit-seeking lines. But if you get to a year where you have to buy new printing presses, or you're not making a profit, or the market's particularly tough, as it was after 9/11, you can then go to the Scott Trust and say, look, it is impossible for us to make a profit this year, and you exist in order to sustain the Guardian perpetuity, hand over the money. And in extremis, that's what they do.
And if they're not handing over the money to you, what are they doing with the money?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, it is. I mean, that's why the editor of the Guardian is ultimately in a very strong position, because legally that money is his. But obviously, you have a sensible conversation about how much it is sensible to give a paper, and you have to make sensible economic projections over the years to come to say, well, how much do we think you're going to need, and we will meter that out. So it's a grown-up discussion, and doesn't often end in tears, but there is that kind of magic card that the editor has, which ultimately says, I am legally entitled to this money, and I will make the case that I need it, but if I need it, I need it.
So in other words, this enables you to tide yourself over through difficult times, to hire when you need to hire, to launch projects that you think may be worthy, and you don't feel constrained by purely market conditions.
No. Which I think is particularly relevant at the moment, because I think in all Western newspapers, I mean, it's different in countries like India and China, it's different in Eastern Europe, but I think in all Western developed countries, there is a perception that there's a line that is going down like that, which is a combination of revenue and sale, and we hope there's another line that goes something like that, which is what's going to happen in the digital world. And between those two lines, there's quite a big gap. And I think all newspapers are wondering how to get from one line to the next. And I think if you're blessed enough to have an owner whose horizon is a bit more long-term than the next set of profits or the next accounting to shareholders, you can, I hope, get through that in better shape than others.
But realistically speaking, you might get through it for a year or two, but ultimately, if you are purely in the market, it's going to catch up with you, isn't it?
Yes. No, I think there's no escaping the chill breeze that's worrying everyone, and we if things took a really bad turn, we would be we're not immune from that.
Now, one of the critiques, of course, of American papers is that they feel rather sensitive about being labeled liberal, whereas you, with impunity, extol your liberality. Let me just read something here. You say, the journey our papers have embarked on is based on the belief that there is still some notion of duty that goes with the privilege of mediating the news debate. And you go on to say that you are a unabashedly liberal paper espousing liberal values. I mean, this is something I think you would never hear in America. And do you think that is owed to the fact that you have this trust lying behind you that enables you to be more unrepentant about who you see yourself as being?
Well, I think again you have to slightly step back and see the context of British newspaper publishing history, and it's just different from here, and that probably goes back to two things. One was the original ownership of British newspapers, which were party sheets, I mean, they grew up as party animals, and it was also due to the law of libel, which protected opinions better than it protected facts. And so you've had over the years these papers that have, the Telegraph is a right-wing paper, the Guardian is a liberal paper, the Daily Mail is a very right-wing paper, and with everything in between, with Rupert Murdoch switching his mind depending on which government he wants to win at any one time, which is a fairly sort of big block vote in the middle. And so, the Guardian has always been a liberal paper, small L liberal paper, and part of the heretofore, I think, when you become editor, is to say, well, that's the tradition in which it will be edited. And of course, you then have a debate about what that means and how do you express your liberalness. Is it in your news reporting? Is it in your comment? Is it in the editorial columns and all that? But it is a liberal paper, and we're proud to say so, not ashamed to say so.
And how do you sort of analyze the fact that people sort of don't beat you up for that, the way they seem to beat up liberal institutions, particularly in the media in this country?
Well, they do. I mean, lots of people hate the Guardian. Quite a lot of them in America, actually. Since we became very popular on the on the web, a lot of right-wing Americans torture themselves reading the Guardian every day in order to send us horrible emails telling us how terrible we are. So,
but those are Americans. I mean, do you get the same abuse from Brits?
We have people in Britain who really hate us and really despise us. But in a sense, that's fine, because if they don't like us, they don't have to read us. They can go and read the Daily Mail or the Telegraph. And that's why I think you've got this very complicated thing in Britain where for all its faults and all its messiness and all its ugliness, this thing about having 8 daily newspapers with different ethical standards and different political opinions somehow works, so that if people don't like the Guardian on one day or don't believe we're telling the truth, they can go to the Telegraph and the Times, and we're always mercilessly criticizing each other and exposing each other's frailties, and in some crude way it just does work.
Do you think that politics in Britain, maybe quite apart from critiques of media outlets, has separated in terms of conservative and liberal to the degree to which you see it happening in the United States?
No, well, I think perversely the opposite is happening at the moment, where you've got Blair, who's absolutely positioned himself in what he regards as the centre, though we could argue all night about whether that's absolutely right, because most of the people in his own party think he's actually become rather a right-wing figure. And then you've got the new Conservative leader, David Cameron, basically saying, I'm like Tony Blair, this is where elections are won on the centre ground, and we're no longer a party of small government and low taxes. We're just like New Labour, except that we're better than New Labour. We'll do it competently, they'll do it incompetently. And you've got the Lib Dems, which is the third party, who tack a bit to the right and a bit to the left, but you've got this massive consensus in the middle. And you can say that's fantastically cynical, you can say that's it has a deadening effect on politics, but it's the conventional wisdom is that is how you win elections now, by fighting from the centre. Again, there's a good and bad about it. I mean, you don't. America looks, from where I live, to be a very divided and uncomfortable country at the moment. I mean, there's something comfortable about Britain and that sort of degree of consensus. On the other hand, you've got fantastic alienation from mainstream politics, particularly among the young. So at the last election, 44% of the young actually bothered to turn out and vote, which has halved in 40 years from 88%. So I think you've got particularly young voters just looking at this and saying it's just too consensual and it doesn't represent me. These politicians are not articulating politics that I can relate to. And so I think you could get quite a dangerous alienation, both on terms of left and right, from people whose politics, they just feel it's not being represented.
Do you think that the reputation of journalists and editors in the UK is holding, or do you think there's a sort of a parallel slide in the estimation of ordinary people that I think we do see in this country?
Well, I think there is an interesting correlation between this low voter turnout and low readership of papers, particularly amongst the young. And if I had to guess, there's been no work done of it that I know about. If you're in this group of sort of, let's say they're the 18 to 28 generation, who look at politics and say, there's nothing there that really reflects me, that I can get no traction on it, it's become professionalized, centrist politics, and there's nothing there that, it's this sort of crude, there's no point in voting because it's not going to change anything atmosphere, which may even be broadly right. If that's what you feel, then I think that translates quite quickly into there's no point in reading about it, because what's the point in reading about this system that doesn't interest me very much? So I think you can get an alienation from that, so that people look at newspapers, the big media, and they say actually that they're just the same as the rest of them, they're basically on the same side. You get the combination of that and quite a dislike and distrust of the tabloids, which may well be justified. And I think that can turn into, does seem to turn into quite low levels of trust in general in media. Now there are exceptions to that. The BBC has extremely high levels of trust. So when we got the Hutton affair a couple of years ago with the government sort of taking on the BBC, I think the government very, very quickly appreciated that if the BBC had to choose between the government, if the public had to choose between the BBC and the government, it would be with the BBC and not the government.
That would never happen, by the way, in this country.
Would it not?
No, no. I think if it was a choice between the media, I think the media is in a state of somewhat fallen state of grace in the view of the public.
The BBC polls above 90% in terms of trust. So you have this highly regulated thing that is ridiculed by newspapers, and the BBC comes in for an awful kicking from this Wild West press, who hate it because they think it's sort of state subsidized, they think it's over liberal, it's sort of breastfed by the taxpayer, and is just appalling. But the public love it, and they really do trust it. And they place great. They believe it really has got integrity, which I think it has. I think the BBC is a wonderful thing. So you have to treat these levels of trust with some. It's a fragmented thing, and that if you ask Guardian readers, do you trust the Guardian? The Guardian gets fantastic levels of trust. Again, in the high 80s. If you stop somebody in the street and say, do you trust the Guardian? It's probably in the mid 30s.
I mean, I have to wonder whether if we, as a nation here, had the BBC, would 90% of our people stand behind it? It's an interesting comparison. I'm not sure they would. Mm. We really can't not discuss the reason why you're out here on the sun-kissed coast, and that is the internet. And for those of you in the audience, Alan and the CEO of The Guardian are going around to a variety of information technology companies while they're here. What are you after? And what is The Guardian doing to sort of reinvent itself as in terms of its online presence?
We're after enlightenment.
Well, I think you'll find it here in California.
I think the people who are thinking most creatively and originally about the internet live in this neck of the woods. And it's just interesting talking to them because the people we're talking to are by and large not generally in the newspaper industry, but they are, I think, having interesting thoughts about communities and connectivity and networks and social networking, which I think are interesting things that newspapers will have to think about.
Do you think they sort of get journalism?
I'm not sure they get journalism, but I'm not sure they've thought about that very deeply. But I think they are interesting about communities. And the more I think about a paper like The Guardian, which is, I think, defined by the fact that there's 3 or 4 things that make The Guardian fairly special. One is this fact that we haven't got this commercial imperative to dumb down, so it's still quite an intelligent paper. It is liberal, it's in the English language, and it's not American. Those are 4 quite interesting things, and I think that does almost constitute a community. So
you have a very high resubscription rate too, which would suggest a community.
Yeah. So if you can somehow harness that community into a conversation and debate, I think that is an interesting thing to do, because I think increasingly in the way that business and the media are working, spaces like The Guardian will be fewer and fewer. So I think that'll be an interesting space, and I think all newspapers are going to have to find ways of binding in and involving their communities of readers. So there are 2 other things that I think make this a rather urgent thing. One is the disaggregation of advertising from editorial, which is the thing that's really scaring newspaper owners around the world. In this audience, you don't need reminding who this man Craig Newmark is, who is done this extraordinary thing of creating a site where advertising is free to both sides, which is a terrifying business model which newspapers, even second-hand car magazines, can't deal with. And the gap between that and the sort of rates that newspapers have traditionally charged is just unbridgeable. So there's quite a sort of terrifying story going on in terms of the economic basis that has sustained newspapers for 200 years and arguably gave newspapers their independence 200 years ago. So that's one scary thing happening. And the second scary thing happening, which I think most journalists have woken up to that bit, the bit that they haven't quite woken up to is the disaggregation of editorial from editorial. So what a newspaper used to be even 10 years ago is gradually being dismembered bit by people who quite often do what we do better than how we do it. So I think that leads you to, it's almost where we began this conversation. If that doesn't lead you to examine incredibly, thoroughly, honestly what a newspaper is, then I think you're going to sort of fall off the edge of a cliff. So I mean that's why we're here, because I think this notion of the community of readers is maybe a helpful way of looking back into a newspaper and seeing what it is that we can do that nobody else can do.
You know, in speaking with you, Alan, you often say that, well, we do make money, the paper makes money, or the website makes money, and maybe you even say how much you make in one year or another. Of course, when newspapers here speak about making money, they speak about a percentage. And the expectations usually of Wall Street, which are quite high, which are 20 to 25% return on capital. But let me ask you, if it's not too bold a question, how much money do you make in comparison to what the expectations are in this country, both on the paper and on the website, in terms of percentages?
In terms of percentages,
Yeah.
oh, they're minus.
They're minus.
They're minus.
Well, then how can you be said to be making money?
We're not.
Glad we clarified that.
No, I think I said that earlier, didn't I? I mean, the Guardian. I mean, the Guardian last year, if you include its share of its cost of its printing presses, lost 48. The Guardian and the Observer and the website together lost 48 million.
Well, excluding that.
It's a running. The loss this year will be. Am I allowed to say this, Caroline? Yeah. Yes. I mean, it's in the region of 20 million. Mm-hmm. And that is, why the Scott Trust exists, because in a difficult year. I mean, let me just explain the context a tiny bit more, because again, these figures are meaningless unless you know them. The Times, which is one of our great competitors, is losing, I'm making this up because nobody really knows, but it's in the region of 37 to 80 million. I mean, somewhere in there is a true figure. I can't tell you what it is. The Independent is losing somewhere in the region of 15 to 20 million. The Financial Times has just lost 56 million in 3 years. So they're all fine newspapers. They're all being sustained by some form of subsidy, by some form of cross-subsidy, either by the Murdoch titles or by the Pearson other business interests or the other bits of the independent newspapers' interests. And you get into this fearfully competitive world. And at the moment, in the 1930s, newspapers used to give away encyclopedias. At the moment, we give away DVDs, which does fantastic spikes for sales because we're in this line, this world in which the declining sale is something that has to be resisted as long as we can. So it's a fantastically expensive, destructive financially business. So it's just a completely different conversation from the one that's taking over here of rates of return of whether it's 20 to 25%. We're operating in an environment where people are, at the moment, just losing huge amounts of money.
I mean, what you're describing is a situation which is untenable in the long run, and it raises the question then that whether the media, in some respects, ought to be like this university or like a university, not expected to make money. In a certain sense, like you. But one can hardly foresee excellence being maintained with business models that have numbers like this. Would you concur with that, or do you see some brighter side on the horizon?
Well, I mean, again, it's a curious thing of the British press scene that there's no shortage of people who want to buy newspapers. So if any of these titles came up for sale tomorrow, I mean, people keep talking about the Financial Times being put up for sale. It would be bought and sold very, very rapidly. So
why is that?
Well, I can't tell you. I mean, when the Telegraph recently came up for sale, it was sold for £600 million by a reclusive pair of twins who live on an island in the middle of the English Channel and never leave it. Now, why did they want to buy it? I don't know. It wasn't for influence. They don't go out. Literally, they live on this island and they never leave it. They don't go to parties. They don't. It wasn't to meet prime ministers or actresses but somehow people like owning newspapers. So when you say this isn't sustainable, you may be right and you may not be right. I mean, I don't know what it is that means that makes Rupert Murdoch invest all his money in the Times, which has no prospect that I can see of ever making money, but he does, and he has his own reasons for doing so, which may be, this is an odd word in connection with Rupert Murdoch, may even be philanthropic. Unlikely, I agree, but for some reason he keeps this paper going.
But isn't that a very odd way to kind of, for a society to construct itself when you yourself have acknowledged this is a critical link in the ability of any democratic people to be anything but brain dead? I mean, to have such a
it's very strange, but it is a form of cross-subsidy which maybe reflects the importance of newspapers in a community, because you can't imagine any other form of business in which hard-nosed business people would exercise that form of cross-subsidy. So I think it reflects the importance of what we do. Whether it's a desirable form of cross-subsidy is, of course, open to much debate.
Let me ask you, just having returned from Iraq recently, I noted that Maggie O'Kane, who I think has written for you, she said this about coverage in Iraq. She said, "We no longer know what's going on, but we are pretending to. Any decent reporter knows reporting from Baghdad now does a disservice to the truth." What would be your reaction to that comment about that very important country?
Well, we had a fairly heated debate in, we have an open morning conference in The Guardian every day in which anybody on the paper can come. And Maggie and Jonathan Steele, who's doing most of our reporting intermittently from Baghdad at the moment, quarrelled a bit about that, because I think, well, if you're Jonathan and you're still going in, to be told that what you're doing is actually a disservice to the truth, I think is a little hard to take. But I think Maggie is broadly right. We haven't had somebody in Baghdad since November, when our correspondent Rory Carroll was kidnapped in Sadr city, trying to do reporting, trying to leave his hotel and go out and interview Iraqis, and he walked into a setup. The whole thing was a trap, and as he drove away from this interview, he was kidnapped, and thank God he was released within 36 hours. But at that point we had to get our drivers and translators out, and it's only recently that they've gone back, and we've been having, anguished debates about whether it is worth the risk to life of sending people back in circumstances where effectively now, once you've got them from the airport to the hotel or the safe house or the green zone or wherever you're going to put them up, it's now virtually impossible for them to leave. I mean, Jonathan, if Jonathan was here, he would say there are still things you can do. You can sit in your safe house, and Iraqis can come to you, and it's still possible to have conversations that give you a better understanding of what's going on than you can from London. So for him, it's his personal choice. He still thinks that he learns things by going there, but it's I think for all of us, it's the most constrained form of engagement with any country that anyone's ever tried to report on, ever. So I think Maggie is broadly right, though I know some reporters would still claim that to say that it's a disservice to the truth is putting it a bit strongly.
Now, Alan, you're a plain-spoken man, and actually I find it quite impressive that you speak as openly as you do about certain political things that I think many editors in this country would want to avoid. Give us your candid views on our president.
Well, I mean, one doesn't want to. Our cartoonist Steve Bell, who's a brilliant and savage cartoonist, draws him as a kind of primate with sort of knuckles. And it's a beguiling image that on the other hand, when you the few people I know who have met him say he's not like that, and he's sharp and he's intelligent, and they're people whose opinion you respect. I mean, what can you say? I mean, obviously, as a liberal Briton, the extent to which a Labour Prime Minister made the calamitous error of allying himself with an administration that made a calamitous error, in my opinion, over Iraq, and particularly in the post-war arrangements, has been catastrophic on almost every level, including on British politics. So that doesn't strike me as very smart. So the people who tell me that he's smart puzzle me. On the other hand, I genuinely believe it's the job of a paper like The Guardian to deal in complexity. So I'm unwilling to go along with the sort of primate stereotype. I mean, there's clearly more going on there than that. But I suppose the best two-word answer is I'm puzzled.
And how do you mentioned your own Prime Minister. How do you analyze his willingness to be complicit?
Well, I did speak to Clinton about this once, and Clinton said that when he left office, he said to Blair, he got on well with Blair, that he said to Blair, stick with this guy, stick closely to him. And I think there was just, that implied a kind of geopolitical role for Britain that was just, it was better to be there and close to him than to break away. And I think Blair believed that, and I think he persuaded himself that by being close that he would have an influence on things that he wouldn't have had if he had walked away. And I'm sure if you asked him that today, he would still say that was true, that he still believes he had an influence that made things better than they would have been otherwise. And I find it hard to believe. I don't believe it, but I think Blair sincerely believes that.
And what in our country, as you well know, there is something of a disesteem of the press. I think it would be fair to say, even of the necessary watchdog role of the press. And I would say that is quite a sea change in this administration's attitude towards the Fourth Estate. In Britain, would you say that the Blair government sort of has shared that sort of sense of marginalizing the press, or has he accepted the press's role but just isn't happy with what you do?
I think it hasn't gone as far as here, but there's no love lost between us, and there's no great. I mean, I think the government has a sort of respect based on fear. I mean, of the press, which is not a healthy thing, I don't think. And I think it was an exaggerated fear in the early days. So there was a kind of sort of an almost a real or unreal belief in that if they could get the right-wing press on their side, they would be all right. And so they courted the right-wing press, and they played to their agenda to an extent that I don't think they needed to. And in the end, the right-wing press despises them as much as they ever did, and they've won nothing in the long term. And their big battle over Hutton, which was, I think, born out of complete frustration at their inability to impose their agenda on the press, was again so unhappy and destructive, because, as I said, in the end, the people backed the BBC rather than the government. So I think Blair has a sort of not contempt, but a distaste for the press.
Do you watch much television, and what's your view of the role of television as a competitor to you and as a vector to inform people?
Well, again, you can't talk about that without the BBC and actually Channel 4, which again is a publicly it's a publicly funded state-regulated bit of the overall media spectrum.
Describe how that's set up, because it's kind of an interesting model, I think, for Americans.
Well, it's amazingly complicated because it's not like the BBC. It's not funded by the license fee, but it is given certain. You probably understand this better than I do, Caroline. It's given certain financial breaks, which the third channel, ITV, doesn't have, and it is officially a part of the. It's not a public company. It's not a public company. It's a what's the word I'm looking for? It's a public service broadcaster, but it is funded by advertising. But it has obligations set on it to, I mean, the reason I'm mentioning it is that it has a very good news channel called Channel 4 News, which does serious news broadcasting of the sort that the third channel, which is purely advertising funded, has more or less given up. I mean, ITN News still exists, but I think most people think it's a pale shadow of what it used to be. So, and then there is Murdoch, and Murdoch has something called Sky News, which is not Fox News. It's again because of the regulation in Britain, it's required to be a proper news channel. So it is impartial and a pretty good news channel. So actually, news on television in Britain is not bad compared with, I think, what's happening here.
And what do you notice about what's happening here?
I mean, again, this is broad brush stuff because I don't watch much American television. But what I see of Fox seems horrifying, and the general level of engagement with a broad international world and an attempt to understand it seems to be missing from most American news, current affairs television that I see. Maybe there and I'm missing it, but it doesn't seem to be there.
I can't say I could contradict you. Well, maybe we'll do some questions from you all. Please raise your hands, and if you have a question, and we'll...
I'm curious about the youth and in Britain and newspaper readership. This is one of the things that is freaking out American papers in a big way, and we've discovered at the school, actually, that a lot of our own students, if they're under 25, 26 years old, don't read papers, which bodes ill for the future. What are you finding there?
Well, when I said that most journalists haven't yet woken up to the fact that there's an awful lot that is done on the web that is better than newspapers, I think that's true. My guess, and it is a guess because there's pitifully little research, is that this 18 to, I think it's almost 18 to 30 generation now, have a few things in which they're passionately interested. So let's say it's 4 or 5 passions, which may be political as defined by them. So, to parody, it might be the environment, or it might be, gender politics, or it might be, broad globalized politics. And these are the things that they're interested in, and which they will find in depth and subtlety and sophistication on the web, or in Britain might be the radio. And that they can go back to that time and time again. They can find these communities where they can discuss this stuff with other like-minded people, again in depth and sophistication. And for the rest, actually, in Britain, it might be Radio 5, or it might be the Metro on the way to work, or it might be glancing at television. The rest, they don't feel a great need to do this broad, mile-wide, inch-deep experience that a newspaper gives. And I think that's why, the challenge for newspapers, really for the first time in 200 years, is to begin by explaining or convincing them why this experience of reading a newspaper will make them better people.
How are you doing that?
Well, every day we think about, the change from broadsheet to Berliner was an acceptance to all the research that said, actually, these big old-fashioned papers with yards of type and dull black and white pages with no graphics and smudgy photographs. That is not a sophisticated design experience for people who are sophisticated in their visual appeal. And you have to do something, you have to sell and explain the news a little harder than you did in the past. So, one of the reasons we spent so much on printing presses was to produce a better looking paper that could be more sophisticated in its use of pictures and graphics in order to tell and sell the story better. And, again, I think in everything that we do at the moment, we think what works best in print and what works best on the web. Because actually just throwing yards and yards of text at people who are probably reading this thing on the way to work is probably not a very sensible way of doing it. But if you can use the paper in conjunction with the web, so in your total Guardian experience, it's all there. But use this as a kind of adjunct to what's on the web. If you can get that right, then probably you can get a more sort of sophisticated offering all around. But it is worrying.
Well, on behalf of the Goldman Forum for Press and Foreign Affairs and the Center for British Studies here at Berkeley and the World Affairs Council, Alan, thank you so much for coming tonight. It's very interesting, and thank all of you and all of our listeners for listening and attending as well.